He was born in the mid-1930s in a little town outside Budapest, Hungary. His father was conscripted to fight in the Hungarian army alongside the Nazis in World War II. Later, when Hungary tried to broker a separate peace with Russia, once the large German attack on Russia had failed and the Germans were retreating back west, Hungary tried to broker a separate peace, and the Germans decided to put most of the remaining surviving Hungarian soldiers in glorified concentration camps. They were labor camps. And this little boy's dad disappeared, they thought, probably forever. Meanwhile, this young boy, whose name was, I got to say this, see if I can say it in Hungarian, I actually practiced this, Onvas, and his mother did their best to survive. The Jews in Hungary had it slightly better than those in some of the other European countries, but as the war dragged on, they were increasingly subjected to all the same persecutions. And this little Jewish boy and his mom were on the run almost constantly through those years. First into the country, and then back into the city when they found out that the Jews in the countryside were being rounded up first. And then when they came to the city to get them, they'd go out and live in the fields and live in shacks. And somehow, little Onvas and his mother fled and managed to make it all the way through the war. Life was then not easy living under the Red Army occupation. At first, they were sort of seen as liberators, and then soon they were seen as overlords. Onvas was at first thankful for this army and the idea of communism as a young boy because it had seemed to have freed them from fascism. But as a young man interested in journalism, he grew more and more disgruntled with the lies that he saw in communism. As a matter of fact, one time there was going to be a big rally downtown, and he and some of his teenage buddies couldn't wait to go there and see something exciting for a change. And they heard the roar of the crowd, and they heard people marching, and they heard shouts, and they made their way through the buildings. As they got downtown, there was no one there. There were the politicians on a podium, and there was the army marching past, and all the crowd and the cheering was all being piped in on speakers. It was all faked for the newsreels that were being made. And I guess you could say little Onvas's rose-colored glasses were cracked. Taking part in a freedom demonstration then at the University of Budapest as a college student, he feared being rounded up and disappearing like some of his friends had been doing. And he really realized that probably his life was in serious danger. So through very difficult circumstances, he left his parents and his home and everything he'd ever known. He'd never even been outside the country, and fled to the United States, somehow making his way across Austria and Germany in the dark and finding his way aboard an old steam vessel and making his way to Manhattan. In the United States, Onvas Grove changed his name to Andy Grove. He attended a city college in New York because it was tuition free, and he decided to study chemical engineering. Then he got married, and they went to California on their honeymoon and decided to stay. And so he figured out how he could get out to California and end up getting a PhD in chemical engineering and became a college professor. But the problem with becoming a professor, even though he enjoyed it and even though he was quite the technical genius, was that he couldn't make enough money fast enough to allow him to help get his parents out of Hungary and get them over to the United States. So he was forced to go work in industry. He finally landed a job at a memory chip manufacturer called Fairchild. At first, he didn't really want to go there. He couldn't get along with the guy that was trying to recruit him. So they sent one of their top personalities, one of their most famous technical specialists, and his name was Gordon Moore. Gordon Moore and Andy Grove immediately hit it off, and Andy Grove decided to go ahead and go work with Gordon Moore at Fairchild Semiconductor. Later, when Robert Noyce, one of the other big, huge sages in the technical world at that time, convinced Gordon Moore to leave Fairchild with him so they could start their own company together, Gordon Moore decided he would convince Grove to go along. And despite the fact that Grove couldn't stand Bob Noyce, he decided to go because Gordon Moore said it'd be all right and he'd take care of him. It was this, by the way, they went and founded a company called Intel. You may have heard of it. It was this Andy Grove, the little Jewish boy who grew up on the run from two of history's bloodiest empires, who would eventually become CEO of Intel, their chief executive officer, and help it become one of the most important companies in business history. There's so many stories in the careers of these three men and the company that they founded, because this is really the genesis. This is the platform upon which Silicon Valley erupted. This is the platform upon which the internet world came from. And this is where the .com bubble came from. And this is where Web 2.0 and all the social networking companies have come from. It all goes back to the engines that these men and the companies that they founded built that supported the entire information age that you and I swim in now as though it's always been there. These guys created that. And there are so many stories that come from the history of what they and their compatriots did that you could speak for hours on it. But I want to pull one little story from the career of these guys, particularly from this little Jewish boy, Angie Grove, and because it illustrates so many leadership principles that we can apply to our daily lives, to our businesses, to our careers. Whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're an intrapreneur like these guys were inside of companies trying to make things happen and later on becoming their own entrepreneurs, or whatever it is that you do, whether you lead a civic organization or a church or you're an educator, whatever it might be, these principles are applicable to a whole bunch of situations. And this particular story I just find very compelling. It was late 1979. The company was a little bit over a decade old, and they had grown quite considerably. They were one of the leading players in the semiconductor market. They had entered the market making memory chips like just about everybody else. Bob Noyce had been instrumental in co-inventing the integrated circuit, and under his shepherding at Fairchild and then at Intel to kind of bring the microprocessor into being. And so they were making both memory chips and microprocessors at this time. And it wasn't obvious yet that microprocessors were the future and memory chips were really just a commodity. So they were doing both at this time. And what happened was Andy Grove, at the time, the COO, just the chief operating officer, he didn't have overall executive oversight yet. He assembled all of the top marketing and sales talent that he had within the reach of the company, both internally and outside agencies that they had on retainer. And he got them all together and he crammed them in a conference room and delineated the problem to them and told them they could not come out until they figured out a solution to this problem. Now the problem was that in the field, Intel's salespeople they were trying to get the message back to corporate that they were losing sales to this big competitor they had, much bigger company, much more established company called Motorola. You see, Intel had pioneered microchips. They had figured out how to put transistors on silicon wafers and to make microprocessors, and they had kind of led the charge on producing these things, and they had come out with a chip, really the first solely contained on one chip probably the first single chip microprocessor. It was called the 8080. I don't know why they have all these fancy names for these things, but the 8080. Obviously they had a brilliant marketing department at that time. And they had followed it up with a wonderful new, and that was an 8-bit, they'd calculate in the 8 characters, the 16-bit is different from memory and microprocessors, but they had come out with a 16-bit chip now called the 8086. And it was a massive advance over the 8080. The only problem was Motorola had leapfrogged them with something called the 68000. They went to the same kind of marketing school, apparently, with the naming. And incidentally, it was that Motorola 68000 chip that I was in a course to study. Mark mentioned I went to Carnegie Mellon. I was in a grad program at Carnegie Mellon, and they had us take a few undergrad courses just so we could slum with the underclass people, you know. And it was in a course where we were learning the assembly level language programming for the 68000 Motorola chip. It was in that class that I met my wife to be. Talk about romantic. In the lab, she got her little trains to go around on the track and not collide with each other before my partner and I did. And I mean, I knew right then she was marriage material, man. But it was that same 68000 chip that Motorola had come out with that had kind of leapfrogged Intel in the marketplace. And part of the problem was Intel being the leader, they'd always kind of just talked about different parameters of these chips, you know, clock speeds, how fast they operate, and different things, and easily measurable little things. And quite frankly, the Motorola chip was better. In all those obvious measurements, the Motorola chip was actually a better product. And designers have been taught to look for those things. It was pretty obvious. And so Motorola started winning what's called design wins. A design win, if you're a salesman back then selling microprocessor chips, you didn't go up to someone and say, "Hey, Mary, how you doing? I have this new chip. It's 16-bit. It can do 120 million calculations per second. Would you like it? She's not going to buy a chip from me. She's designing some new product into which that chip must fit. And it's going to come out how many months down the road, and the chip goes into it. And so she's going to sign a contract with me to deliver her a bunch of chips over time in these products. That's a design win.